Hello and welcome to another episode of the Business Growth Accelerator. Brandon here, your Chief Marketing Strategist, with a fantastic interview featuring Professor Joe O Mahoney. Professor Mahoney is a professor of consulting at Cardiff Business School located in Cardiff, Wales, UK, and is a growth advisor to boutique consultancies. He has a rich history of working as a corporate management consultant, an independent consultant, and an internal consultant. He is considered a leading authority on the consulting industry and has researched, taught, and written about the sector for over 15 years. His textbook on management consulting is a bestseller, and his academic work has been published in leading international journals. He has also won several awards for his teaching and research work. Additionally, Professor O'Mahoney has been advising large consultancies on innovation and helping small consultancies improve their revenues to get ready for sale. Professor O'Mahoney is also the CEO of Consulting Mastered Limited and hosts a podcast called Consulting Growth Podcast, where he interviews founders of successful firms, acquirers, and growth experts. And with that, let's get on with the show. Professor, appreciate you taking the time here to come on the Business Growth Accelerator. I know right now here it's 4:30 in the morning. After doing a bit of research, I realized you were across the pond after I booked this call. Tell me, where exactly are you located?
Listen, Brandon, first of all, thank you for getting up so early in the morning for me. I do appreciate it, and also appreciate you having me on as a guest. Thank you. So I'm in Cardiff, which is in Wales, which is part of the UK. I can get to London in 2 hours, which is where most of my clients are. But it's a small enough city you can get around on a bike, and but it's big enough that there's always something going on. It's not. In pre-COVID, it wouldn't be the ideal spot for face-to-face consultancy because it's a relatively poor country. Post-COVID, it doesn't really matter where you are, does it?
No, it doesn't. I'm so glad that we're out of that part of our lives, and so getting back to normal, if you want to call it normal, with everything that has been going on in the world. So you mentioned you're in Wales, and I just finished watching a series on Hulu about a football club that Ryan Reynolds had just purchased. It brought a lot of fanfare to the country there in the particular town he was in. What did you think about that series and how he's taken that football club from zero to hero almost, so to speak?
Yeah, it's such a good story. It's made for Hollywood, isn't it? And that's Wrexham FC, who've had a checkered history. But he's certainly done amazing things for it, and I'm hoping he's making his money back just based on the rights that he must have sold to the documentary makers. But yeah, no, it's fantastic. Anything that can. Wales is a very sporting country. I moved from London to Wales, and one of the things that really struck me was there's just everyone's involved. Everyone apart from me is heavily involved with sport, and so anything that can bring attention and cash to the game is a positive in my book.
I would have to say he has done a great job in marketing the team, the series, and everything else that he touches. He pretty much turns to gold. He's by far one of the better marketers out there for his craft and what he does in acting. So, but today isn't about Wrexham FC. Today is about getting to know you, what you do, how you do it, and how people can benefit from your vast amount of knowledge that you've gained over the past, 15 years you've been in the consulting industry?
25 years if I include. I did a bit of consulting during my PhD. And so it's been 2.5 centuries. I sound old.
No. Well, during the time you've worked as a corporate management consultant, an independent consultant, and an internal consultant, right? So how have these different experiences shaped your perspective in the consultancy industry?
That's a really good question. It's not one I've been asked before, but it's really useful for me to have seen all aspects of consulting. So I started off as a junior consultant. And of course, as a junior, you don't really have a view of what the partners think and what their needs are. You just do your job, and if you think you do your job well, you're going to get promoted. And of course, that isn't true. You get promoted on the basis of sales, because that's what's important to partners. And then having grown and sold my own firm, going through that process, you really get to know it's less what's important for the partners, but what's important for the people buying your firm. And that's a flip that I help a lot of founders with. They're focused on growth, focused on margin, and all of that's really, really important. But that's probably only 50% of the story for someone who's buying your firm. So again, you've got to make this flip of judgment about how you see the firm and what it is. And then as an internal consultant, if you think, normal consulting is political, I dare you to become an internal consultant, because it's less about making margin and more about sort of obeying or keeping the different stakeholders and powers happy. So it teaches you to be quite political. So I've learned a huge amount through my experiences, probably more than actually studying this and all the research that I've done. There's nothing like living it to give you the real life, lessons, I guess.
So with that, you've gained a bunch of authority in the space when it comes to, growing a consultant agency and then being able to sell it off. And I know that's the main goal for most consultancy owners. They want to build that list up as massive as possible, help out as many people as possible, and have that continuing revenue coming in. But at the end of the day, they just don't want to let it, flounder by the wayside. So as a leading authority in the industry, what do you see the biggest challenges facing the industry today, and how can they be addressed?
Okay, it's like you've done this before. These are really good questions. So thank you. It's much better than, how do you feel about the weather in Britain, which I can talk about. Okay, so the industry is going through quite a big change, everyone seems to be obsessed about AI at the moment, but it's going to have quite significant repercussions for the consulting industry. So consulting industry is, as you know, is a very top-heavy industry. So 50% of the employees are at the big firms. And then you've got this very long tail of tiny little firms. There's very, very few firms. There's probably only about 30 in the US of 1,000 people, which shows you how big the drop-off is. Whereas there's, in the UK, 50% of our firms have fewer than 3 people in them. It would be similar in the US. So you've got that balance, and what's happening is that the big firms are getting so big. A lot of the people at the senior level are getting frustrated because they're not making partner. They leave and start up their own consultancy. So a lot of the talent now is in the boutiques. And a lot of the clients are now thinking, if they want innovation, they want creativity, they don't want the standard, form filler, bureaucratic answers. They're going to go to boutique. So the boutique industry is growing at about 5 times the rate of the big firms. So the growth of the boutique industry is around 25%. So you've got that dynamic, but then on top of that, you've got the whole AI thing. And AI has, it's hammered law, it's hammering medicine, it's having huge inroads in the SaaS and software industry. Consultancy has been relatively immune because, believe it or not, organizations are very complex and there's lots of different answers to one question. So a client might say, how do I improve productivity? How do I motivate my employees? Well, throw a stone and you'll hit someone who has an answer on that. And so it's not like law in that respect, but AI allows us to deal with that level of complexity. So that's another major disruptor, especially at the junior level. Already we're seeing a lot of large consulting firms getting rid of juniors because in effect they can use AI to answer a lot of the questions that juniors did. So you've got these big, and there's other long-term trends. Day rates aren't going up as fast as partner salaries, and salaries are. So you've got this squeeze on margins. The large firms, especially, clients aren't as ignorant as they used to be in terms of what consulting is and how it works. So they're a bit smarter. They're asking cleverer questions. They've got big procurement departments. So you've got all these pressures on what used to be a very flush industry, very cash rich. And don't get me wrong, it's McKinsey, Bain, and Boston are still making decent money hand over fist. But in the rest of the industry, things are getting a little bit tighter. You've got to demonstrate value as well as give value. And you've got to be right on it with technological developments, because otherwise your competitors are going to be able to offer things at much lower cost than you are. And that's throughout the industry, big, small, and medium-sized.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I know price is always a fickle thing when I deal with my clients, being on the marketing consulting side. I had a prospect want social media work, and I was giving them X, Y, and Z for a particular price. I know I'm the highest in the market, and they ended up just going with a company to just give them X when they just didn't. I failed in helping them understand why they needed the Y and Z alongside of it.
Sure. Well, it seems like marketing consultancies are being disrupted left, right, and centre, because, as you know, just keeping on top of the new software and apps and capabilities is almost a full-time job.
It is, and there are a lot of shiny objects out there that need to be. I'm trying to think of the word here. Cautioned in just jumping on board and buying without knowing if they're going to be legitimate for you, because it can be a huge waste of money to bring on these softwares to try to implement them into your workflow, and they just don't work.
Yeah. And the lesson in your area is the same lesson in consulting. The key question is, what are you trying to achieve? And getting that question right. And then you look at the software and you look at the options for implementation. But hopefully that fundamental question of what are you trying to achieve and how are you trying to achieve it is still going to be done by people. I hope so, for your sake and my sake.
For sure. There has been a lot of talk around AI, especially in the circles that I run into online, where a lot of people are asking those lead questions to boost their algorithm in the Facebook feed and things like that. Is AI going to end up replacing your job? And I don't feel that AI is going to be replacing too many jobs. I feel that AI is going to create more jobs, because at the end of the day, AI is a computer program. And if you get really good at telling a computer what to do, then you're going to have a job. So your job isn't going to be replaced. It's just going to be enhanced, so to speak, or just kind of switch gears.
I hope so. So.
So you are a professor at the Cardiff University, correct?
Yep.
Most professors have to write their own textbooks. And your textbook I found to be a bestseller. So what inspired you to write this book, and what are the key takeaways of this book?
Sure. Okay. My last book was called Growth. So growth in the digital age. How to scale a consulting firm in the digital age. And I interviewed I think it's 75 founders of consulting firms that grew and sold their business. And the reason I did that, so it's slightly different. In the US, anyone that works in a university, I think, is called a professor. In the UK, unfortunately, to get professor, you've got to spend 20 years climbing a very greasy pole and publishing fairly consistently to get there, which means you have to be obsessed with evidence and data. And that's what I am. And one of the things that frustrated me year after year teaching and researching consultancy is that there was a lot of really, really bad advice out there, typically given by 23-year-olds in dodgy suits promising that they can scale your business to 7 figures or more, which I can understand why they're making these promises, but it's simply not true. I mean, there are exceptions. That kind of thinking works with SaaS. It works with software. It doesn't work with consultancy so much. Consultancy is still very much a relationship-based industry, despite all the technology and despite the funnels and websites and all the rest of it. So I guess I wanted, all of my advice is based on data and is based on evidence. So it's a massively under-researched area, boutique consultancies. All of the research is on the sexy firms, the McKinseys, the Bains, the IBMs, the Deloittes, and there's very little on, boutique consulting firms, which are really, really important to the economy. I mean, their margins are huge. They pay vast amounts of tax. They employ loads of people, and they export services, which is great for the balance of payments. But virtually no decent evidence there. So I wrote the book really to collect and publish evidence on how successful consulting firms grow and sell. And there's a series of lessons through the book that, I think provide a bit more depth than your average sort of, how to do it in 10 easy steps. There aren't 10 easy steps, unfortunately. A lot of it is blood, sweat, tears, luck, and hard work. And I hope some of that, I use every chapter is interspersed with a case study. So I try and give the coalface view of what it's like to grow and sell a firm.
Okay. You brought up a lot of good points there. As a relatively new consultant on my end, as I mentioned with the marketing consulting,
yeah,
I have found it slightly difficult to just rely on the technology to get the client. Realize it's definitely going to take a personal touch to actually reach out, get people on the phone, and go visit these people in person when I find the errors in their ways, especially when it comes to the digital foundation that I intend to correct. So I'm definitely going to look that book up and give it a good solid read back to front.
Thank you.
And front to back, depending on how you have it written.
Yeah, it might be in Arabic. You never
know. So during this time, you've done a lot of research, as you mentioned, and a lot of publications to maintain that professor title. Can you talk about the work that you've done and what are some of the most interesting findings that you have come across as you've researched the industry?
Sure. Yeah. That's another really good question. The work I've done is it's kind of a mix of qualitative and quantitative, and this has really been going on for 20 years or so. Interviewing people at the top, interviewing people at the bottom, interviewing people that buy firms, and also the mediators in the middle. And a lot of the advice comes from either people who are trying to sell you a quick fix, or they're trying to buy your firm. And so there's lots of advice I could give, but I'm going to try and give the non-standard advice, the stuff that perhaps might be slightly different to what people would normally see on the internet. So the first thing is, when you're selling a firm, I would avoid someone that deals on both sides of the transaction. So you've got the buy side, you've got the sell side. You want to be dealing with people that focus on the sell side and don't do the buy side. And the reason for that is because there's a conflict of interest. So if you've grown your firm to however big, you want to sell it, you come to me. I represent buyers and I represent sellers. Now, you're only going to sell your firm once, but the buyers are perhaps going to buy 10, 20, 30, if you're Accenture, 500 firms a year. So it's in my interest to keep Accenture sweet. So if I can get them to do if I can get you to do a slightly better deal, to settle a little bit, to go for Accenture when you perhaps should have gone for someone else, then Accenture are going to smile on me and perhaps give me future business, further down the line. And that's conflict of interest that people don't talk about. The second thing is that there's also a disparity of conflict between what is a good firm financially and what's a firm that is ready to sell. So buyers are looking for firms with fat profits. So in the year or two before you sell your firm, it's important to get advice from someone that isn't the bank, from someone that isn't doing the transaction, that's going to help you get your firm into the right state. And a lot of founders think, well, listen, my profit margins are great, my growth is great, my EBITDA is solid, my gross margins and all the rest of it, so the finances are done, tick, tick, tick. Well, that's not really why most buyers buy firms. Most buyers buy firms. Okay, the finances have got to be solid, but they're looking for your piece in the jigsaw that's got to fit into them. So quite early on, you've got to have a view of who might buy you and for what reason, and you need to focus and invest in those areas. And you cut back on investment in the last couple of years, so you don't want to be starting new things and developing, putting money into SaaS and all the rest of it, which might be a good thing to do if you're not going to sell the firm because you're talking about long-term future revenue. But really, you want to be maximizing margin and ensuring that you are that jigsaw piece that other people aren't, and really demonstrating that, focusing on your things like employee turnover, things like the average length of your clients, things like your pipeline. So, if you can show a slightly longer pipeline, your value is going to go up. So perhaps instead of getting everyone into the year before you sell, or the 2 years before that, you might push things out a little bit so that you can show a solid pipeline. Because when people buy you, they don't buy you on the basis of what you've done in the past, although that's very often the only data they've got to go on. They're going to be valuing you on your future earnings, and the only metric they really have for that is your pipeline. So there's lots of little things like that you could be doing to enhance the value of your firm. And one final thing on the sale: founders love focusing on profits. Margin, margin, margin. Well, actually, when you go to sell, the margin, the EBITDA, is the basis of your sale price. This is in the consulting industry. There's other ways to value the firm. What buyers will pay is a multiple on that EBITDA. Now, in consulting, the average multiple is 7. But by doing relatively straightforward things, you can push that up to 8, 9, or even 10, 11, 12 times EBITDA. So you want to be thinking early on, is it worth me trying to get another 1 or 2% EBITDA margin added to my bottom line? Or is it worth me investing in things that are going to increase that multiple? And very often it's more economically beneficial to the owners of the firm to invest in the things that will improve that multiple, rather than trying to eke out an extra percentage point or two on the margin. Does that make sense?
It makes 100% sense, and it got my gears turning in my head on how I'm going to move forward in growing what I'm growing. So, in the 5 to 7 year exit plan that I have, written down, I do maximize that selling price. But I've always heard the money is in the list. So, when you talk about the pipeline, and the evaluation of the consulting firm, is the current list more valuable, or is it the systems and processes in place to grow that list consistently more valuable?
That's a really good question. So unfortunately, the answer is both. There's a slight difference in strategic buyers versus private equity. So private equity are looking to maximize their cash. That in effect, they see you as a machine that can scale. They put in X, they want 10X coming out. So if you don't have the systems and processes, they're going to put them into place, but that's going to be a cost for them. And they'll take that into account when they're talking to you. So ideally what they want, they would rather have a firm that was showing quite big jumps in margin and in revenue, and they're less bothered about the infrastructure because they can put that in. But with a strategic firm, they're going to be more interested in that jigsaw piece. What services can they take of yours and cross-sell to their existing clients? What services have they got that they can cross-sell to your clients? So they're looking for things that you do that they don't do, that they can maximize their cross-sell on. So it's a difficult one. Typically, what would happen is the systems, processes, standardization will increase your multiple. So if you've got a high level of standardization, you're using ERP, you're using CRM, you've got some type of professional service automation, you've got your finances automated, then you can probably add an extra 1 or 2 times to your multiple. And depending where you are in the life cycle, you might be better off focusing on that rather than trying to improve your profits each time. However, there's a time period where that has an effect. So I've got a client at the moment, they want to sell next year, and we've had a big discussion about putting in professional service automation, and the payback on that is typically 18 months. So they haven't got time for that to have an effect, and the investment might actually damage their EBITDA. And what buyers want to see is not just a solid increase in your profits and your revenue year after year, but ideally they'd also like to see an increase in your margin percentage. So they'd like to see it going, 20%, 21%, 22%. And if any of those figures take a dip, especially in the year or two before sales, it's going to raise some eyebrows and it's going to damage your valuation.
Gotcha. Okay, definitely noted there. So, in your tenure as a consultant, you've advised several large consultancies on innovation, including KPMG and IBM. Can you share some of those insights from those experiences and how they've influenced your approach on teaching and consulting as a whole?
Wow. Okay. Yeah. So, the students love hearing about the big firms. They're not interested about, Capacitas or whoever, the brands they haven't heard of.
Mm-hmm.
Even though they should be, because I would, any students listening to this, I would look at the boutique market. Boutique market is, they pay as much as the large firms. They're more interesting. Anyway, I won't talk about that now, but I could do. The big large firms struggle with innovation, and I said to you before the podcast, this is odd because IBM spends billions on innovation. I think it was 14 billion when I was consulting to them. And McKinsey, the same with them. I've consulted to McKinsey, and you think, well, they're the experts on innovation. Why would they? But people don't necessarily buy consultants because they have a skills gap. Sometimes it's an objective outside view. Sometimes it's the legitimacy of having the professorship and being evidence based. But large firms struggle with innovation, and the reason for that is that they make margin by being part of the machine. So you create a machine. It's it's a sausage. What's the right phrase? It's kind of a factory approach, a McDonald's approach. Mm-hmm. And they want even the strategy firms. They standards, methods. I was interviewing one of the senior partners at Boston Consulting Group and said, what advice would you give to a junior joining? And he said, follow our method. Don't be creative, don't be innovative. Follow our method until you really get it, and then you understand it. It'll take several years. Then you can be a bit more creative and innovative. And what tends to happen is that you get a separation in large firms. They'll have an innovation department. Now, as soon as I see innovation department or innovation section, I start to worry, because that means that innovation has been taken away and seen as a cost and put separate to the rest of the business. Whereas, you're probably not old enough to remember the total quality management movement coming out of Japan. I don't know your age, but this is going back to the 1980s. And, they demonstrated with loads of evidence that if you want real innovation, you've got to build it into the fiber of the business. And so you had, the Toyota method and total quality management, Kaizen, all the rest of it, where innovation was, emphasized in every individual employee, and they were given space to innovate and make changes to their work. And in the large consulting firms, they don't do that because they don't see it as economically viable. But what's happening is that clients who are looking for innovation and creativity are leaving and going to the boutiques, because that's where a lot of the talent and creativity is to be found. And so the large consultancy business model is based on these huge, £500 million projects that they can get a few margin points on. That's with, say, the IBMs and Accentures. So they struggle with innovation. I do less of that work now because I found that, I think I said to you, I found that the large consulting firms, whilst they pay very well, they tend not to listen to the advice because they're such big behemoths that they're not going to spend, to make any changes like changing the direction of an ocean liner.
Hmm.
Whereas with boutiques, they're keen for the advice, but also they tend to implement it, and you can see the results happening quite quickly.
Yeah, so you're kind of like the speedboat then of the watercraft in the water can make
Yeah,
quick changes, and it's I think it's more fun to ride a speedboat than in a
yeah,
than in a big ocean liner.
yeah. More rewarding, not necessarily financially, but certainly emotionally. You get to see the changes that you're making.
For sure. And you mentioned age there. I'm a child of the '80s, so when all that was coming out, I was in diapers crawling around.
Okay.
But it did have a 20 plus year cycle, I guess, because out of college, I was a pharmaceutical quality control technician. I guess is the best way to describe the position there. And they started bringing those principles and processes in with lean and kaizen and all
Okay.
that. So I did end up becoming white belt certified. So Lean Six Sigma
Okay.
is in the blood a little bit. I am obsessed with systems and processes because I personally feel that if you have the right systems in place, you can be more hands off in the business and working on it instead of in it.
Yeah. Yeah. And very quickly on that point. What tends to happen with some firms is that they realize they need to bring systems and processes. They get past that family atmosphere. They get to a certain size. They think systems and processes. They'll bring a load in, and then they won't change them. And sometimes they bring too much in. Sometimes they bring the wrong systems in, and then they're stuck in this sort of electronic concrete. So any firms that are going through that process at the moment, don't just think the journey ends when you bought the processes or the systems or the IT in. There's a constant process of tweaking and improving that if you don't do, it's probably going to hit your margins somewhat.
Yeah, and I think it did for that organization because after I left, I still continued to follow the company, and I was 3 or 4 years down the road. The shareholders were not pleased on how much money they spent on the program that they implemented and how much money it did not make them.
Yeah.
So that's yeah, it
Yeah.
was kind of a big deal. So you mentioned students
Yep.
a while ago to be potentially listening to this podcast. So you're still a professor at Cardiff there, and you've
Yep.
won several teaching uh, of excellence prizes. Can you
Yeah.
share your philosophies on teaching and how you engage your students?
Sure. Yeah. Thank you. You can see me smiling. I love teaching. I came to academia not really to study and write, but really to teach. And I mean, anyone that's come from a business background that goes into universities will note how poorly we educate them on the practical things, and that's really my focus. I can write theory, but I really don't think it has much of a place in teaching. I like giving students practical skills. I get them working with live clients. Um, I don't teach Porter's five forces and the seven P's of strategy. I try and get them doing stuff, experimenting, breaking stuff, and then learning from it because let's face it, you and I, we can only give advice because we've been there and done that and made the mistakes. So I'm a big fan of the practical stuff, um, and also I'm I wrote my first book on consultancy for the students because there wasn't a decent book on it was all very theoretical the books, and so my first book, which was just called Management Consulting, you'll find is practical. It's full of examples. It's full of cases, and yeah, I love it. And also, I try and get the students jobs because I'm relatively well connected in the industry. Um, if I can get a student a placement or a job or some type of project with a firm, I will do so. And because I'm especially well connected with boutiques, I can tend to spot what type of student is going to fit well with what type of boutique. So it kind of works both ways. I'm keeping my clients happy by getting them, cheap, good labor, but also I'm keeping the students happy by helping them get jobs sometimes.
Okay, so you are working there on the background outside of the education system there, which
Yeah.
and doing the research, I found out you are the CEO of Consulting Mastered Limited. Can you tell us more about that company and its mission, and how do you balance your responsibilities as the owner, CEO, and as a professor?
Yeah, sure. Okay, so good, another good question. So I am. So Consulting Mastered, so I've got two companies. One is joeomahoney.com, where I do my advisory stuff. Consulting Mastered is mostly around online courses. So what I found is that a lot of small firms uh, can't afford me to come in and give them advice or act as a non-exec director or an advisory board member. So I created online courses, a few online courses for consulting firms with a couple of other experts. And so Consulting Master just provides the online courses. In fact, I'm in the process of shifting that. I'm shifting all the material to Joe O Mahoney because I think it's useful to have a single point of contact there. Balance is a really difficult question. It's like the situation when you're using your car for business purposes, but how much of that car can you say that you're using for business purposes? Because there's a lot of overlap, or your laptop or anything else. So I do 1 day a week consultancy and 4 days a week at the university. I'm going to shift that at the end of the year to 3 days at the uni, 2 days consultancy work. But there's a massive amount of overlap because the lessons I learn from my clients, I then teach the students, obviously anonymously. I don't mention any of my client names. And then I get my students and put them with some of my clients to do market research or strategies and plans or social media plans or whatever. So there's a huge amount of overlap, and it's quite hard to draw that dividing line. But I'm quite comfortable with that. I'm less, I think the university, if it was being quite strict, it would say, well, no, you need to delineate between the university and consulting work more thoroughly. And I always get told off for using the wrong email, for sending to my Cardiff University email address. But for me, it's the same as being a consultant. You just try and provide value, and that's where good consultancy work comes from, and successful companies come from. It's a relentless focus on value. So if I can keep my clients happy and keep my students happy, to be honest, I'm less bothered about administrators in the university telling me off for using the wrong systems. I hope they don't listen to this.
Well, it's on it's going to be on every podcast platform that is out there, so they may end up coming across it if they do a good Google search for you. But I'm sure you'll have a good answer for them. Wow. So you yourself have your own podcast, the Consulting Growth Podcast, where you interview founders and successful firms, acquirers, and growth experts. What inspired you to start your own podcast, and what has been the most surprising thing you've learned from your guests?
Okay. So I spent 15 years interviewing CEOs of boutique firms and CEOs of some of the large firms, and it didn't occur to me to publish any of it. And I see that as a major wasted opportunity. And it was only about 2 years ago, I thought, because as an academic, you've got to be obsessed with confidentiality. So you go through huge, strict ethics processes, and you've got to have permissions. And, for something like this, you'd have to sign a 2-page form, and, I'd have to give you the questions in advance and all the rest of it. And I'd have to go through the university ethics procedure. And so, publicizing anything as a podcast, you think, well, it's completely off the scale. But actually, when I spoke to potential interviewees about it, they were quite excited. As you know, so it took me a long time to realize that, number one, my interviewees, would actually prefer to have a wide audience. But number two, that my students and some of my clients would be really interested in some of these stories. So my podcast focuses exclusively on people that have grown and sold their firms. And obviously, if you want to grow and sell your firm, you're going to want to listen to some of those stories. So I've been doing it for about 1.5 years now, and I do one a month. And in terms of lessons learned, there's loads. So what I love I mean, the advice, as you all know, in growing and selling your firm is to systematize, process. But that's not always the case. And occasionally I come across a firm where the founders focused on what they wanted to do. They do interesting work. They don't really have strict processes. They might have a few in the background around pipeline management. But certainly when it comes to the consulting deliverable, every deliverable is unique. There isn't a standard operating procedure. And those companies might take a little bit longer to get to the sell point, and their margins might not be quite as big. But sometimes the journey is a lot more enjoyable. And some of the people I've interviewed and some of my own clients have actually got to that 30-person stage where it becomes pretty essential to bring in process and procedure, and looked over the hill and said, well, we actually don't want to have that type of firm. So then they've scaled back to 20 people. Now, there's advantages and disadvantages to that. The other thing is that, the average size of a firm that is sold is around 30, 40 people. And a lot of people forget that, and because the banks and brokers want the deal to be as big as possible, a lot of them will say, well, we're not interested in you unless you're bringing in 20 million plus. But actually, there's a whole load of firms that are sold relatively cheaply through brokers or just directly, without any intermediary at all, who are pretty small. And that's especially true in the tech consulting, if you've got AI or cybersecurity or data migration, data analytics. These firms, very often, might have 5 to 10 people in them, but because that skill set is so rare and because, they just can't keep up with demand, it makes sense for them to sell, and they can very often get a decent price. But I guess the biggest thing for me is the sheer variety of people that grow and sell their firms. And I always find it funny when you listen to leadership blogs or podcasts, and you have to be this type of leader, and they talk about Bill Gates and Steve Jobs and the rest of it, and actually, it's as varied as the type of people that you get the the hard-working workaholics who sell their firms in 3 to 5 years, but you also get people who enjoy the job and don't think of selling their firm until they get to a certain size. And the final thing I'd say is the amount of luck involved. Business academics and business consultants don't like talking about luck because it takes away from their magic, their secret sauce, their 10 steps or whatever. But there's a huge amount of luck involved. And if you happen to start your firm in the right area, say, AI in 5 years ago, or you happen to leave your big consulting firm with a client in hand, and that client happens to be Microsoft or whatever, or you just happen to meet the right person as a business partner, it can have a huge impact on your business. And neither founders nor buyers like talking much about luck, but my studies show it's a fairly significant part of the success journey.
Yeah, I would say the luck definitely plays in growing the consultancy or any job or business, really. It's who you run into at the right time at the right place, and you can't really get by without it. So as a growth advisor to the boutique consultancies, what are the most common mistakes you see these firms making, and what advice do you have for them?
Okay, so any advice I give needs to be caveated by it applies to 80%. So there are 20% of consultancies that can quite happily ignore this advice and still be very successful. So there isn't a one-size-fits-all, advice I would give. It tends to be tailored for the specific consultancy. But common mistakes, I would say, in order of importance, are number one, not starting off with a plan, even if the plan is, a plan to sell. So if you're starting up, what does each year look like? What does that mean in terms of the number of people you're going to take on? What does that mean in terms of your revenue, your pipeline, how much sales you're going to have to do, how many clients you're going to need to do, and what does that look like at the bottom in terms of EBITDA? And you want to have that mapped out. And obviously you want to adjust it because, you can't take into account the economy or a big client disappearing or all the rest of it. So number one, having plan. Number two, not anticipating the inflection points. As you know, I don't do much on theory, but S-curve theory has it been demonstrated? I don't think it has. I think it's a nice theory, though. There are inflection points in every consultancy. Typically, when you first take on your first employee, typically when you get to about 30 odd people and you need to bring in some systems and processes, typically when you bring in the next layer of management, and then typically once you get to about 120 people, and it's impossible to know everyone in the company unless you have a photographic memory. So you've got these inflection points, and you need to be thinking ahead of the curve. So you need to be thinking about, what do I need to have in place now that is going to make the next inflection point painless, or as painless as possible. Whereas what tends to happen, especially having been through this cycle a few times, is that founders, they're growing, oh, isn't everything great? Take on a few people. Oh my God, she's doing a really bad piece of work. Why is that? Let's start having a go at her, instead of thinking, well, what's the cause of that? Well, the cause is because they've been brought on. They don't know what they're doing, and you haven't spent enough time with them. And you can't spend enough time with them because you've got 30 people in the firm. Or you get to this point and suddenly your sales dip. Well, why have your sales dip? It's because you're responsible for sales, and you just simply can't feed the beast enough. So number two is really thinking ahead in terms of the inflection point. Number three, I'll only give three because I could talk about this all day, is a lack of attention to culture. People often talk about your unique value proposition in terms of the market, but there's also, if you're a boutique, there's a unique employee proposition. Why is someone who has never heard of you going to join your firm instead of joining McKinsey, Bain, or Boston? You need to have that. One of the metrics that buyers look for is, what's your employee turnover? How happy are your people? If you can tick those boxes, you're adding another multiple onto your final figure. So, really paying attention to culture. What do you stand for? What don't you stand for? What is not going to be acceptable? What type of people are you looking for, and how are you going to keep them happy? And one of the ways you do that is by giving them equity. And again, founders think, I need to keep hold of all the equity because 100%, and it's all, you're getting all of the small pie instead of a smaller part of the much bigger pie. So again, I could talk about this all day, but I think your listeners might get a little bored. But those are my top three.
No, those are three great pieces of advice there for really any business, not just consultancy. So I appreciate you sharing that with them. And we're coming up to the end here. I really hate to see this end, but if you could have put yourself in my shoes during this interview, what question would you have asked yourself that I did not ask you?
Damn, you ask very good questions. I think these are the best questions I've been asked on a podcast. So thank you. Okay. I guess. Okay, so there is one thing, and I'm not sure what the question would be, but I can give you the answer.
Okay.
So, Pat, let me try the question. The question would be, what about mindset? What regrets do owners have? And I think this is there's a psychological trick, and it's like when your child leaves home. I've got two little boys. We spend all our time together. They woke me up at 4:30 in the morning, and so there's a bit of you that thinks, oh, for God's sake, I can't wait till they leave home. Not much, but a little bit. Now, when they leave home, I know I'm going to be in tears, and it's the same with growing a company. A lot of founders think that if they make that money, if they make the 10 million sale or the 20 million sale, that's where happiness lies. And I get a lot of quite existential problems with founders after they have sold and the baby has flown the nest and they're in this earnout and they're thinking, well, I've still, I'm not as happy as I thought I would be. So preparing for that properly, psychologically, is a really important thing to do. Life doesn't end once you've sold your firm. And, we tend to lionize these founders who have sold their firms, as great heroes and all the rest of it. But actually, they usually face the same problems after they sold their firm as before they sold their firm. And the number of founders I have heard say, Once I've sold, that's it. Going to put my feet up, take it easy and relax, buy the yacht and all the rest of it. And within 2 years, they're back starting another company because they've almost got that addiction to growth and achievement. So I think the answer to that is being aware of what drives you. Why are you doing this? Are you doing it because you worry? Your childhood has made you worried about money or mummy. It's another one. Am I seeking some approval from other people? So what's driving my need for success? And if you're aware of that, it prepares you a lot better in life once you have sold or once you failed. Failure happens, something that we don't talk about much, but most firms fail. And so really being aware of what's important to you and what drives this growth journey psychologically is important. That's the question I would have asked, I think.
That's a great question. Probably better than the other 9 or 10 that I've already asked. I did not get into the mindset aspect of consultancy work, and it's definitely needed. You have to go into anything you do with the right mindset, definitely with the end in mind, and it's the only way that you're going to be successful. Without a plan, you're planning to fail.
Yeah.
Well, Professor, this has been an absolute pleasure on my end. I hope it has been for yours as well. Where can people listening to this get to know you more and take advantage of the resources that you have to offer?
Sure. So I've got a load of free resources on joeomahoney.com. I'll give you the link to that. And also, if you connect with me on LinkedIn, I probably publish 2 or 3 times a week. I'm doing a lot on AI in the consulting industry at the moment, and I'm publishing all of that stuff, obviously free of charge. So I put out a lot of intellectual property and ideas on LinkedIn. So either my website or LinkedIn.
All right, awesome. And folks, as you know, everything is going to be noted in the show notes, so be sure to check out the notes either while you're listening to this or just after the show. Well, again, Professor, I appreciate the time. I will let you get back to the rest of your day. I'm just getting mine started here, and hopefully we'll be passing in some circles in the future.
Yeah, great to meet you, Brandon. Thanks for your time.
You too as well. Thank you again for listening to this episode of the Business Growth Accelerator. If you received value from this, please leave a positive review on whatever platform that you are listening to this podcast on. Also, be sure to check the show notes for all of the free resources that Professor O Mahoney has for you, whether you are a consultancy looking to grow, expand, and then sell, or another type of business that just needs a little bit of help getting to that next level. Professor Mahoney's teachings will work for you as well. And as always, here's to your success.